Welcome everybody. We'll be starting the webinar very shortly, just giving a minute or two for more people to join us. If you've already joined, if you'd like to say in the chat box where you're joining us from, that would be really lovely. I can see people logging on already, so we'll start very, very soon. Just click on the chat box, which is on the bottom of your screen, just below the slide, and say hello and tell us where you're joining us from if you can. Okay, we might get started. Welcome everybody to this Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply Victoria branch webinar or Fireside chat, property in the post-COVID era. I'm thrilled to have over 100 people registered today. Just to introduce myself, I'm Sinead Williams and I'm the Secretariat and Committee Member of the SIPS Victoria Tasmania branch, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. So I'd like to advise everyone that this webinar is currently being recorded and will be made available to all of you next week. Allow me to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, to our Maori people, and to the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'm joining you from Northcote, which is Wurundjeri country. I'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also I acknowledge any First Peoples who are joining the webinar today. For those of you who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals, dedicated to promoting best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raising awareness of the contribution that the procurement and supply management profession can make to organisations. So let's begin with just a few housekeeping notices. All attendees have been muted during the presentation. However, we ask that you use the Q&A chat box to write any comments or questions you have or that you'd like to share with the panelists. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment with some preset questions that were submitted to us beforehand. And after about 20 minutes, we'll move into open audience Q&A where you can pose your questions. So thank you again for joining us today. Can I ask the panelists to please put on their videos and I'll introduce them to everybody. Thank you. Okay, well, let me start with introducing Elias Anastasiou. With over 20 years experience in corporate real estate, Elias has worked with a number of large corporates, including Barclays Capital, Pfizer, Nissan Europe, Shell, Mobil, United Petroleum and Orica. In addition to having a strong property background, Elias has also completed a postgraduate degree in strategic procurement and is responsible for the general management of the procurement function within the Lynx Cargo Group. And we also welcome Stephen Rowe, a respected property procurement and supply chain executive who has worked with multinational companies across the world. Stephen is passionate about growing global businesses and building highly motivated teams. Stephen's current role is as Director of Shanaray Consulting, where he has engaged with multiple ASX-listed clients to lead property procurement and organisational change management initiatives across the banking, FMCG, private equity and retail sectors. And we also have Jonty Lamb, who's joining us from beautiful Auckland today. Jonty has been with Colliers since 2007 and has extensive trans-Tasman industrial advisory occupier property experience. Following working for the Colliers Australian occupier business for the last 7 years, Jonty returned to Colliers New Zealand to establish and lead their industrial occupier advisory team. And last but not least, we have Peter Evans, with over 25 years experience in the property industry and currently leading the National Portfolio and Transaction Management team, which is part of the Occupier Services Division at Colliers International. Peter specialises in the industrial property sector. He works closely with a variety of major industrial occupier clients to develop and deliver their national property strategies, which include sourcing and securing new sites, negotiating lease renewals, property acquisitions and disposals. So the very first question is for you, Stephen, and that is, what are the biggest design element changes that you are seeing as office workers start to return to the office in a post-COVID world?
Thank you for that. The first big one is the obvious, which is the distancing. So the banks of workstations have gone, the hot desking's gone, a lot of the meeting rooms are being reused for alternate purposes because most people are doing meetings virtually these days. Then there's the contactless nature of the buildings that the employees will be coming into. So many organizations, as you pass through airports, for your passports, there'll be facial recognition as you go through the customs. Similarly with new buildings, there's a lot of those elements being put into place. And combined with the facial recognition is also temperature monitoring as well. Even organizations aren't going down that path. They've developed apps so that you go through the security gates using a mobile phone. You can summon lifts using a mobile phone. Your lockers are opened by your mobile phone. So it's all about making sure that the touch points within the building is limited to prevent any, obviously, COVID spread. Lifts, again, are impacted by utilization. Generally, there's only 3 or 4, depending on the size of the lift, as to how many people are getting in there. So combined with all the changes, it's important for organizations to put into place some sort of desk booking system to enable the flow of employees coming in and out. Also, any organization that leaves it to the employee to come in will end up having an empty office on Monday and Friday and an absolutely full office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So again, it's balancing all those elements for both what employees need and what the actual building can contain. From also another element there, which is an article I read, was employee change fatigue. So also organizations have to put into place the fact that employees have had a significant amount of change, and coming back to the office, they're going to be confronted with, again, a significant amount of change, which will take time to overcome.
Thank you very much. That's a beautiful looking office you've got behind you there, Stephen. I wouldn't mind being in that myself. The next question is for Elias. Is this the start of CBD decentralization as more office spaces move to home or urban activity centres?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sinead. And it is a good question, and it's obviously been debated widely over the last 6 to 12 months with lots of varied views. The funniest view I heard this morning on the way to work on the radio was politicians are suggesting maybe implementing some sort of penalty system to large corporates that aren't encouraging workers back into the CBD. But I think that's a conversation for another day. But in short, in relation to your question, my personal view is I don't believe this is the start of the decentralization of the CBD. I think it's actually been ongoing for a number of years. If I look at Melbourne specifically, there's a number of activity centres that have been established for some time, and I think they'll continue to grow. I don't think it's due to COVID. I think it's just the development of Melbourne as a commercial precinct. If I look at Melbourne specifically, again, you've already got major inner metro hubs such as Richmond and Cremorne and Abbotsford and Collingwood. In the southeast of Melbourne, you've got Chadstone, Hawthorn and Mulgrave. Again, they've been established for a long time, and I don't think it's being triggered by COVID and the pandemic and I guess the future outlook. My only other comment, which I think is worth noting, is I don't think there's a perfect model, and every organisation, in my view, has different requirements when considering whether to locate in the CBD or look at some of these urban activity centres. And as a recent procurement professional, I'm always looking at the evaluation criteria, for example. And look, when selecting an office, you've got your typical evaluation criteria when you consider amenities and general surrounds, and obviously cost. As a procurement person, you're always looking at the cost. But I think some of the more intricate criteria that sort of emerged is, particularly when you're looking at relocating to suburban markets, is the impact to existing staff and the retention and attracting new staff. But I think for me, the most critical element when determining whether or not you locate a business head office in the CBD or a remote location or an urban location is access. And I think that's the most critical point from my perspective. And when I compare Melbourne, for example, to other global cities, I think our public transport, particularly rail, really is a burden and has detracted from those activity centres growing, for example, like the London market and the Hong Kong market. So.
Thank you very much. And Elias, there are a couple of questions coming in the Q&A box for you, which I might save after we've done the pre-ones, but there's a couple that are there. So hold on to the attendee who put those in, and I promise we'll get to them. The next question is for Peter. What opportunities are there for landlords and owners of commercial or industrial property during this time?
Thank you for that question. I think we need to look at the drivers behind what is moving the market at the moment. Some of the interesting sectors that we're seeing change in is the influx of large quantities of money from offshore coming into our market, driving the requirement for industrial property investment. We've seen considerable reduction in cap rates, which is driving the market to unprecedented lack of return to the investor. What we're finding is that the opportunity for occupiers of property is to take advantage of this weight of money coming in, which is driving incentives up and driving demand from the investment market to secure long-term tenancies.
Stephen, would you like to add anything to that? I had you flagged for that question too.
Yes, certainly. What I'll do is I'll break it into two. First of all, you've got the industrial sector. The industrial sector is on a huge growth because of the change in the supply chain. Warehousing and industrial units are in great demand because they're having to transform their supply chains to deliver almost like an omni-channel approach to the supply chain. So there's huge automation going into large warehouses for direct supply into customers and also into retailers. So omni-channel is multiple avenues of moving through. So the industrial sector is on a significant growth. But from a commercial perspective, when you look at the likes of HSBC recently, who have offloaded 40% of their global office space, it indicates that there is a rethink around the office space strategies. And also going to Elias's point, there are also local community hubs being set up with co-working areas. So in my view, I think we'll see a lot of the CBD occupancy. It will remain, but it will be reduced. And therein lies another challenge because there's a lot of office space coming online. And so with the reduced demand and the office space coming online, I think Sydney currently vacancy rate is around 13% and Melbourne's around 12%, though that might have changed recently. But landlords have to certainly think about a more flexible approach to leasing to enable people to stay in the CBD from a growth and reduction flexibility rather than a rigid, you have 10 floors, you've got to occupy 10 floors. There may be some sort of flexibility in new types of contracting coming through. Certainly, location is another element, which was a driver for CBD and office spaces. That desire of location is diminished slightly. Some organizations who felt the need to be in the CBD now no longer have to be in the CBD. And on the flip side, some of the large organizations or the big consultancy companies, they'll always want to have a CBD office space and presence. So again, I think there's a separation in the marketplace of those who want to stay and those who don't.
Thank you. The next question I'll pitch at John T, but we'd also like to get Stephen's take on this, but I might get you to handle it first, John T. What are you seeing in terms of trends within the industrial market with a shift to e-commerce and distribution?
I think that the biggest factor that we're seeing on our side is a real focus on supply chain review and optimization now. It's probably something that Stephen can probably speak to in greater deal than I can, but I think COVID has really forced occupiers to take a much more holistic review of their operations and their portfolios, and we're now starting to see people really look at, you know, networks and supply chains, and that's become a real point of interest. And from our perspective, that's really starting to drive people's thinking, and that's now starting to have a really big influence on property strategy.
Stephen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, further to my other comments as well, that within a supply chain, it was always just in time. So lean was the flavour, and for decades actually. And when COVID came along, borders shut down and transportation shut down, the weakness in the supply chain was the lack of critical inventory within the system. And so again, from a warehousing industrial perspective, instead of offloading warehouse to move to just in time, organizations are looking at their critical materials and goods and starting to put inventory in place with a risk. They're looking at not just cost anymore, but they're also balancing with risk. And so from an industrial perspective, all the way down the supply chain, there's a demand for industrial sites to actually accommodate the increased levels of storage.
Thank you. And Stephen, I'd like your comment on that too. Sorry, I beg your pardon, Peter. If you could comment.
There's three main drivers here. Number one is the e-commerce growth. So in 2020, we saw e-commerce grow by 60% against a growth of the previous year of about 12.7%. And the biggest mover in that space was the 80% growth in the online food sales area. This has led to the big players like Coles and Woolies both committing to major distribution centres, which are due for delivery in 2022. Also, growth in online sales across the board in 2020 was 9.1%, up from 6.3% the previous year. What we've seen is the buildings are getting bigger, they're getting more complicated. Our clients are partnering with the external consultants, helping them design, because the capital demands of these warehouses is much higher than it ever was before. The other interesting fact that is in relation to the market as we speak today, the industrial sector is by far the most strongly performing sector. And at the moment in Melbourne and Sydney, there's 800,000 metres of requirements in the market against a market take-up historically of about 200,000 metres each city. So we've got double the amount of requirements in the market for space that we would have over the last 15-year period. It's an interesting market, interesting and dynamic marketplace at the moment.
Certainly is. I might like to, sorry.
I was just going to say, Pete, further to your comment, I think there's definitely been a real shift in terms of the type of facility now. You know, we're now talking about multi-level warehouses and, you know, also the way that occupiers are looking at better utilising their facilities. You know, when you look at things like automation and the likes, you know, to assist with, you know, newborn customer demand and expectation that seems to have come to the forefront, you know, so rapidly recently.
Yep.
The next question is for Peter. What opportunities exist for occupiers within the current climate or market?
I think there's some really great opportunities at the moment. What we've seen across the Eastern Seaboard since COVID is a increased interest in quality covenants in the market. So I think we've seen over the past 6 months, incentives increase somewhere between 2.5% and 7% across the eastern seaboard, where whilst rents have remained steady. The future pipeline of land, particularly in New South Wales and Sydney, coming to Badgerys Creek, all that surrounding industrial land is coming online 2022, 23, and developers are taking a pretty aggressive view of the way that they're trying to backfill some of that land that's coming through the rezoning process. I said earlier about offshore investment. There's $26 billion trying to find its home in the industrial market in Australia at the moment. And the effect on this is demand for occupiers. So with the cap rates reducing, there's more land coming online in the foreseeable future. There's a real opportunity to take advantage of historical low rents, but take advantage of the incentives that are being offered in the marketplace at the moment.
Thank you. Jonty, any comments on that from a New Zealand perspective?
Look, I think from a wider ANZ perspective, I think that, you know, that strength of covenant now appears to be more valuable than it ever has been. So, you know, with us working with our occupier clients, there's been a real opportunity to try and lean on that additional value that now exists within that lease. That all comes back to, you know, that the motivation from that landlord sector that Pete's just touched on. I think, you know, in addition to that $26 billion worth of money that's looking for a home, we're also starting to see offshore funds and groups looking to enter the Australian market. So, you know, if you look at a prime yields have probably sharpened by a full basis point. So there's a lot of compression there, and ultimately, you know, the value of the lease is probably worth now more than it ever has been. So from an occupier perspective, I think there are just some really exciting opportunities out there today in the current market.
Thank you. Now, the next question is for Elias. What are some of the emerging strategic property priorities for your business or clients?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sinead, but I just wanted to make a comment to the last question, if I could, before I answer this one. So I know Jonty and Peter really focus on industrial, but one of the biggest opportunities I've seen, particularly sort of following on from Stephen's earlier comment on vacancy rates, particularly in commercial office markets such as Melbourne and Sydney, they have increased significantly in the last 6 to 12 months. And one of the biggest opportunities in that office market is those CBD landlords are offering significantly more generous incentives. So we've recently gone through a process in Sydney where we've completed a stay versus go for our head office. And the incentives, if you had have asked me 12 months ago, they were probably around 10 to 15% in Sydney, North Sydney. Incentives for CBD offices at the moment are anywhere between 30 and 40%. So that's anyone looking at commercial office space, now is the time to be doing a renegotiation with your landlord. And going back to sorry, Pete.
Elias, can I just jump in there? An interesting fact on that is the interesting part is deals are being done. So from January to March 2020, Colliers did 70 transactions over 2,000 metres in the commercial office space on the eastern seaboard.
Yeah.
Year to date, we've done 200.
Yeah, wow.
So the market's about to move. So there is a real sweet spot here to support your case there.
And further to that, Elias, we've just concluded an office process for a client of ours in Melbourne. We put a brief into the market, which wasn't small. We received 70 responses back from the market. So yeah, that kind of demonstrates, you know, the level of opportunity from an occupier perspective. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Elias.
And I'll get back on track, Sinead. Your question was in relation to strategic property priorities. for businesses and clients. And look,
I didn't need to repeat it. You've been paying attention.
I remember the question. I remember the question. But look, I break it down into two segments of the market. There's obviously beneficiaries of COVID, and there's obviously organisations that have really struggled with COVID, and every organisation's been different. If I look at our specific business and clients and customers, we're probably in the category that hasn't benefited from COVID. So look, our focus and property priorities really focus on cost savings and cost saving initiatives. And if I talk about some of the high level property priorities that we've been focused on, particularly in the last 6 months, it's been focused on exiting non-profitable, non-keeper sites. It's also involved looking at consolidation opportunities to drive operational efficiencies. Some of the other priorities that we've been focused on are lease regearing opportunities, and it's a little bit similar to what I mentioned earlier about the North Sydney opportunity, where, and when I'm talking about lease regearing opportunities, it's proactively engaging with landlords to extend leases or exercise options early in exchange for bringing incentives forward. And those incentives can be rent abatement, capital injection, capital improvement, that sort of stuff. And then the last priority that's worth highlighting is reviewing freehold assets. So they're properties that you own, and whether or not there's an opportunity to sell those assets with vacant possession or subject to a sale and leaseback, just to improve the balance sheet situation of the organisation.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got quite a few questions coming through on the chat box, so I might move to those. The first one, I'm not sure, but I think it might be pitched at you, Elias, but let's see. Do you believe that in the pre-COVID era, many businesses invested to their detriment too heavily in securing leases for A-grade property for either office space or operating sites? And how do you see this evolving in what is now the post-COVID world? Do you think it'll be a key focus for property teams going forward? It's a great question, isn't it?
It's a great question, and it's a long question. Look, my simplistic view is we're going through a lull at the moment. I don't think it's a long-term impact. I think, for example, the CBD office market will recover. It might, no one has a crystal ball. It might be 12 months, it might be 24 months, but I'm confident that the CBD will recover. To answer the question, I don't think businesses invested to their detriment. I think, look, you can only play what's in front of you, and look, no one's got a crystal ball. There are opportunities, obviously, to answer the second part of the question, to, I guess, address that surplus space. And I'm not sure, again, if it's short-term or medium-term, but of course, property professionals will be focused on reducing those costs. But I did hear an interesting analogy, which was after 9/11, no one thought anyone would be going back into the CBD of New York. Within 12 months, it bounced back and everyone went back into the CBD. Again, I don't think this is a long-term shift. I think we're all hopeful that, COVID will manage itself. But I genuinely believe the CBD will return. The only comment I can't answer is when. Is it 12 months? Is it 24 months? So, yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Peter, if I can just make a quick comment, Sinead. What we're also seeing, as I've experienced from some clients as well, is because of what Peter and Jonty were saying with regards the incentives and the declining rentals, a lot of organisations, long-term property planning, they're looking at more flexible environments and reduced static staff, so they don't need this office space they've currently got. And so what they're doing is they're taking the opportunity with the reduced rates and the higher incentives is to move from B grade properties into A. And therefore what you'll see is a movement in the CBD of where the CBD concentration will be. Melbourne, for example, it's moving more down to Southern Cross and the Docklands area. I think that'll start rapidly increasing, and the Collins Street area will start diminishing from Bs to Cs. So I think there'll be a migration of office staff, and I do agree it'll recover, but it's a case of where will the new CBD within the CBD be.
Thank you, Peter. And anything you'd like to add to that, Peter or Jonty?
I feel that there's a level of confidence that appears to be coming back to the market now. I think particularly in that office sector, and that ties into the statistics that Pete shared before. I think there was, probably close to a 12-month period where a lot of organizations were just really taking a sit tight and wait and see what happens approach. And I think a lot of groups now there's a greater level of comfort in terms of now starting to make decisions into the future.
The only comment that I'd make, Sinead, was it'll be interesting to see how businesses encourage their staff to come back to work. There is definitely a push from businesses to get a higher occupancy rate than what they currently are seeing. And I think the flexible working environment of what we're going to end up with, I'm not sure anybody actually knows what that is as of today. But to support the others, yes, it's all going to be about flexibility and being able to ramp up and ramp down space as it's required, instead of locking into 10-year leases and riding them through the journey. Because I don't think anybody really understands the space needs for those periods of time as of today.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I work in a human resources role, and we've got the hybrid working, 3 days in the office, 2 or the other way around. And you try to incentivize people with, subsidized gym memberships, or maybe they prefer to do that exercise on Zoom at home and they've got used to that, like I have. And as you say, it's a complete unknown. We don't know going forward how many days we will be allowed to work in the office and what the occupancy and space rates are. So tentatively, one step at a time, we're getting there. This isn't so much a question as a comment. I agree with Elias that there has been a move to decentralization and remote working for a number of years, e.g. hot desking, limited work from home driven perhaps by technology, the demands of employees and cost pressures. Corporations have traditionally been slow to adopt these new ways of working, but COVID seems to have accelerated this. So I suppose this person is asking about what the panel thinks on the change management element of this whole issue. I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on that.
Well, I'll jump in there with what we've seen across both the corporate office and supply chain is a huge ramp up in the technology adoption roadmap. It's in many cases, it's leapt by 7 years within the space of one, and that's not going to stop. So from a technology perspective, as we all know, the conference calls services, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, most organizations aren't looking for every employees to go back, though I did read that one large global bank, not in Australia, decided that they're not going to change and they're going to insist all employees come in 5 days a week over in the US. Don't know how that will fly. But yes, I think the COVID drove the technology, and now the technology is an enabler to change the profile of the workforce. And organizations have now developed trust in working from home that didn't exist before. And I think, as said earlier, there's a transformation happening. It's work in progress. I read an article called The Great Experiment, and I think we're still in it.
Totally agree.
So we have another comment. Sorry, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel like there were quite a few traditional organizations that operate in quite a traditional way, and were very old school in terms of wanting all of their staff to come in and work from the office. And I think COVID's probably reshaped that a lot. And further to Stephen's comment, it's a lot of organizations probably look back now and think that, yes, this is feasible, although it probably wasn't something they would have considered unless this had have happened.
Absolutely. I mean, with a HR hat on, Jonty, all I can say is that it's brought about the death of those meerkat managers, as they're sometimes called, the micromanagers that like to pop up over the partition to make sure you're there and look at your screen. And now they can't do that anymore, and they've had to trust us to work from home, and we've proven we can do it. So
Yeah.
I think you've already answered this, but Chris, thank you for your question. Chris has said, do the speakers think that COVID has brought with it a cultural change? Will this be a permanent change in the way we work? I think we all agree that it has, really.
It has, and it's also created the corporate social change as well. You've got people working from home, but they still need to meet and greet. So there's what we're seeing is, as I've mentioned before, the co-working and serviced offices are in a boom at the moment, because with this liquid workforce, they need places to meet. And so instead of the office being stuck in the CBD, they'll have to be like local hubs for the workforce, because the workforce will tend to group in certain areas. And it's a case now of going to where the workforce is rather than asking the workforce to come to the city. And that's going to create some social change. And technology is, again, the enabler for that to happen.
Thank you.
If I can provide Sinead, if I can provide another comment. Look, I think the working from home phenomenon has made a material impact on culture in an office. And I've spoken to a number of peers pre this panel workshop, and you have some organizations that, you know what, you've got less than 20% of people coming back into the office. And when there's no people in the office, it does materially affect the culture. So I think we need to find the right balance in how we manage and maintain a culture in an organization, particularly when people are working. So many people are continuing to work from home. So look, one of the challenges for our business is encouraging people to come back in. So I think we need to find that right balance, and it may take a little bit of time.
Definitely. I mean, the human interaction is a really important thing, isn't it? And I've been back in the office now half the week for about 6 weeks. And the first couple of weeks, I was lonelier in the office than I was at home. There's nobody else there. It was so quiet. At least here I could pop up over the wall and talk to a neighbor or something. It is getting better. It's getting there. We'll get back to normal eventually. I do have a couple of other questions. Any changes or movement to regional centres like Geelong, Ballarat or Bendigo? I realise that's a very Victoria-centric question, so apologies to Jonty over there in beautiful Auckland, but we are the Victorian branch. Any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to make the initial comment to get the discussion started, Sinead. Look, being a Victorian, I know Geelong pretty well. I know Ballarat and Bendigo pretty well. Look, I think those areas will grow eventually. And I say eventually, I think it's really reliant on the infrastructure projects that have been identified and potentially funded to improve, again, that accessibility to those regions. I think from memory, Geelong's got a population of, what is it, close to 250,000 people. I think Ballarat and Bendigo is a little bit smaller. But I think those areas will grow. But I think it will grow when the fast trains arrive and the infrastructure is there. But yeah, that's my comment on that question.
Anybody else?
Yeah, well, my view on that, it's still on average an hour and a half, 2 hours road trip or train trip to these locations. There still hasn't been the major exodus from the CBD. And as Elias says, the growth will happen, but I don't think COVID is going to be the driver of growth there. It's going to be the infrastructure and the technology's there, but it's actually, we've talked about social change, and there's the need to meet and greet. If you're moving yourself from the central hub, and you've got the airport, you've got the train centres, and all the hubs here, to move an hour and a half away from that to 2 hours, and that's drive time. It's 2 hours or an hour and a half of unproductivity of a person in that car, and therefore I think that's what's putting organisations off moving into those regional centres. And if the high-speed trains get here and it only takes half an hour or an hour or under an hour to get in, then that's a different story.
It's also the talent pool as well. Like when you look at the population of those regional centres, you're limited from a talent pool perspective. So I think those areas will grow, but it's probably in the long term, not in the short term.
Well, actually, that's a good segue into the next question when you talked about the logistics of it all. We've got a question here from Michael. Will staggering start times be the key, like transport and the number of people you can fit in lifts? I know we've got an issue. I work for a government department, and we're back at the moment to pretty well 60% capacity, everyone doing 3 days a week, and we can fit 4 people in the lift. We have another major federal government department in a building not far from us, which shall be nameless, and they haven't been able to return because their lifts don't fit 4 people with the appropriate spacing. So any comments on things like those logistical issues of staggering start times, numbers in the lift, work hour flexibility, and so on? Any thoughts on that?
I'll start off on that. As I mentioned from the first question around what changes are happening, there are all these restrictions, and the key element for organisations is to schedule staff in. It's, as I've said at the beginning, that if you don't have a schedule, you'll end up with an empty office on Monday and Friday, and you'll have a full office during the 3 days during the week. So desk booking systems are critical to understand the flow. With the desk booking system, you can have a look at the FM manager or the space manager can have a look at how many people are expected in. You'll be able to identify which desks need cleaning. And so that scheduling is critical for the space deal, because employees will go in there if they feel safe. And if you have all the touchless technology and the various elements in place, like you can actually call lifts using your mobile phone. Some organizations, you don't touch buttons, you use a mobile phone to do your lift. And that can be managed, that app can manage capacity in the lifts and give you wait times. So there's lots of technology now. As I've said before, that the technology has leapt 7 years. There's a lot out there that people aren't aware of or are using at the moment. And these are enablers to make the working environment much better and to actually manage capacity.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that from other panelists? No. One other person did pop in a question about whether any of the panel members are aware of some of those incentives that I briefly alluded to encourage employees to come back into work. Are you aware of any of your corporate clients dangling any carrots for people to return?
They seem to be, a couple of our clients seem to be very fluid orientated with these incentives. So one of our clients, which occupies about 50,000 metres of office space in the CBD, has put on 2 full-time baristas. I'm not sure that really does it for me, but, and Friday night drinks are coming back, and the suggestions from this client that may be twice a week. I'm not sure that is the right solution. There's other people offering gym memberships, free car parking, other things like that. I will say to you, I don't think any of those incentives have been particularly well received or effective at this point in time. I think we need to get our mindset correct that people want to come into the office and work rather than come in because they're going to get a free coffee, if you get where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. I think it's more about the human interaction. We've had these discussions at the workplace about how nice it is to actually have, a human. And for the first time, I had a coffee with 2 colleagues that I have only interacted with on Zoom for 12 months. And finally, to sit down physically and have a coffee was such a treat.
I've got one of the big incentives as well is that the environment is safe for employees, because you're quite right. They want a lot of employees want to go back to the office, be it 2 or 3 days a week, but they need to know it's safe and they don't bring back COVID to their families. So again, the important message to organizations is to make sure your infrastructure is right and ensure that the employees feel safe, and they'll come back because they want to.
It's the corridor conversations and impromptu meetings, I think, that people are missing.
Yeah.
That's right. I've heard some interesting, I'm an alumnus of Bain and Company, and I get their alumni newsletter, and there was a real talk about how innovation dropped when you didn't have the human interaction with water coolers.
Yep.
So it's quite a good one. I've got a really good question here from Abayomi. Thank you very much for this. Is there a possibility for commercial office property owners to start converting their facilities to holding stores for online stores as the idea of lean office and working from home increases due to COVID? Are there any innovative ways to get patronage back? It's an interesting one. I have heard of that, actually, of facilities being used for warehousing. I've just read about that in the press, but I just wondered if you'd like to comment on it.
It sounds very similar to what's happening in the air industry, where they're converting passenger planes to cargo planes because of the falling quantity of passengers. But I think what rather than storing goods into buildings, they probably want to maybe look at to manage the flexibility as we've been discussing. It might be a good idea for them to look at putting in there some co-working spaces or shared sort of managed office space to utilize that space for a period of time until the demand picks up.
Yeah, I agree with Stephen there. I think that surplus areas, if landlords consider creating flexible hubs, I think that would be really beneficial. I've also read that, you know what, particularly with the B grade and C grade office buildings, converting them into residential, I haven't heard of them being turned into holding stores for online facilities. The other interesting concept that I was made aware of pre-COVID was the Chadstone Shopping Centre, which was struggling to get patronage. And I know they've spent a lot of money repurposing some of that retail space into hotels, for example, office accommodation. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is, I think these office buildings need to be turned into activity centres where it's more than just an office. It needs to have other ancillary uses just to promote that interaction. And again, it'll help incentivize people to come back into the CBD.
Now, I've got another interesting question here. How has the technology been used for overall facilities management, like robots, etc.? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in there. During my time at Spotless, again, looking at the shopping centres like Chadstone, cost of cleaning, 70% of the cost of cleaning is labour. And so having a look at that situation, there were robots introduced to clean the big wide malls that go down there. And that was working quite well, but unfortunately one robot seemed to like going into the photo booth every night and getting stuck. So I think the technology is up and coming in those areas, and it's going to be developed. From an FM perspective, robotics maybe no, but more around usage of the likes of drones. So you don't send people up onto high roofs to check roof quality. You can send a drone up there to inspect roofs. And then if there is damage, you can then send somebody up there. So there's a lot of use in FM of technology. If looking at from an FM perspective as well, the actual building management systems, there's a lot of development going on in those as well. Again, use of mobile devices, accessibility, but you don't want everybody wanting to change the temperature of their floor, otherwise the system will just collapse and your HVAC will just switch itself off out of confusion. But you've just got to, with a lot of the solutions now are cloud-based, so you don't have to have them sitting on servers. And that building management system can monitor people movements. If you're looking at the robots to do entry, which is similar to the passport controls with facial recognition, temperature controls. There's a lot of applications for robotics to really ease up on the, or to help manage FM, because again, it's all about making a safe environment. And if there is an outbreak, you need to be able to contain it quickly.
Any other thoughts on that? I do have one other question in the box, but any other thoughts on that before we move on? No. We have Michael, thank you for this, Michael. I believe there's many companies like Telstra advocating for their staff to work remotely. What do you think is the real future balance with the majors in the CBD, considering, as Stephen pointed out, that technology has leapfrogged by 7 years? Has there been any research with these major companies in the city on their requirements going forward under COVID-19? And he's just put as a little addition to that, with JobKeeper ending this month, supporting infrastructure around CBD offices and restaurants and so on. Word on the street is that more of these businesses will fold, making it even less attractive for office workers returning to the CBD. Any thoughts?
I'll just phrasing a thought with the global bank decided they weren't going to change and going to have everybody come in regardless. There's the swing from the pendulum. Then you've got Telstra saying everybody's going to work from home. There is a balance, and with like every pendulum, over time the pendulum will slowly center, and there will be a balance. But as I think either Jonty or Peter mentioned, we've not hit the point where we have found what is the new way of working for post-COVID world. And yes, there will be extremes coming along, but I strongly believe it's around making the workforce, giving the workforce flexibility, letting them choose to come in when they want to, or 2 to 3 days, or whichever days an organisation feels comfortable, but to make that environment safe for them. I think that's the go forward until everything starts settling down and we get a long-term view. Yes, technology has grown, but we've also got to understand there's people and their people behaviours. And for behavioural change, it takes a long time.
Thank you. Now actually we do have one more question. Should we be starting to have more pop-up testing facilities in the CBD as company doors start to open? And that's from Michael. Well, I think the short answer might be yes, Michael, but any final thoughts from the panel?
Well, I think, yes, there will be instances where there is, everybody will get nervous if someone's got a dry cough, or if they've entered the gate and the temperature control's gone off, and they will need to be, to save the person going all the way home, if they can speed up a sort of almost immediate test to say whether they've got COVID or not. The containment will be instantaneous, but also so will the decision that they've not got it, and they can continue to work without having to be isolated. So I think, yes, it should be there, but hopefully they'll get the testing done much more quickly with a much quicker response.
Thank you. Now we're almost out of time, so before I do the honours in thanking everybody, any final words from Stephen, Elias, Jonty, Peter?
As I started out, I'll wrap up. I think the property market is in a period of transition at the moment to find out what is going to be the new normal after COVID. But I think what COVID has done is it's revealed the weaknesses in supply chains, in operating, in how people mind processes are within the commercial space. I think this is a reawakening and a redesign of what should we be doing down the road. And as I've said before, we're in what I regard as the great experiment. This is happening globally. It's not just here in Australia. And it's a case of wait and see how things evolve over the next year or two.
Thank you. Well, sorry?
I was going to say the final comment I'd make, Sinead, is look, there's no better time to be in the property space. Look, it's a continuing, evolving market. COVID has presented a lot of opportunities for occupiers and landlords, and it is obviously a specialist area, and one of the key addressable spends for a lot of organisations. So I think it just needs the focus and expertise.
Thank you, Jonty. Any last words from Tasman? Sorry.
I agree with Elias's comment. There have been some huge opportunities, particularly for our clients of late, and they've taken the opportunity to review and take a really proactive, strategic approach to some of these opportunities. I have seen that our clients are placing a much greater emphasis and expectation around advisory and consultancy. I think our clients are expecting more from the groups that they are entrusting and partnering with. So I think it's, yeah, there are definitely some opportunities, and there are some positives that have come out of all of this.
Thanks, Jonty. And Peter, I'm so sorry I spoke over you.
Just a couple of quick comments. I think from a commercial office perspective, the workplace strategy that is put in place today needs to be seriously looked at, because it's a moving feast and we need to plan to succeed and build teams again, number one. And property in the commercial space is about people, not about making people fit into the property. The property's got to fit the people. And then from an industrial perspective, I think there is a focus on a number of things. One is supply chain optimization and security, focus on last mile logistics, given the e-commerce and the demand for just now. Consolidation of warehouse functions is going to happen. Supplier sourcing will change, and flexible logistics partnerships, either whether that's direct property or through a third-party provider. But I think the other thing that will come into this space is digital property. And by that I mean the short-term, quick availability of warehouse solutions or property. So the flex office model will come into industrial in force, and I think we're probably accelerated that by 5 years through COVID. It's all about flexibility.
Thanks, Peter. I want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today, especially also all of the attendees for taking time out of your busy day to come and join us and support ZIP. So thank you. But a special thanks to our presenters, Elias, Jonty, Peter and Stephen. I'd also like to call out my lovely colleague, Ravi, whom you couldn't see on screen, but Ravi is the Vice Chair of the SIP's Victoria Tasmania Committee, and it was Ravi's hard work that made this possible today by bringing together these fabulous panelists. So I hope you've all enjoyed this interesting and thought-provoking webinar. A copy of the webinar and list of any unanswered questions, as well as a recording, will be sent to all of you next week. And a gentle reminder that there will be a post-webinar survey when we log off. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.